Okay, so interesting thing that happened this week. I was actually sent a video showing a game running with frame generation active, but it was dynamic frame generation. So basically, you could dial in a specific output frame rate that you wanted, and you could see that the input frame rate was basically changing all the time. This is a really interesting concept, right? The idea being that you basically set the output frame rate to be the refresh rate of your display. And then frame generation is kind of like filling in the gaps. Now, what is the technology doing this? Is it NVIDIA? Is it AMD? The answer is no. It's lossless scaling, which is a tool that you've looked at, Alex. Mm-hmm. And obviously, the concept that you can add frame generation to any game is compelling, but there are some caveats with it. But I really wanted to test this out, right? So we've got some footage here. We're going to kick off, I think, with Control. The first thing I did was to go to the Corridor of Doom. Now, the system that I'm using here is the Ryzen 5 3600, the RTX 4060, which is mirror image of what Alex's mainstream system is these days. Which you deeply dislike the RTX 4060.
I don't like that GPU that much. No, pretty much don't at all, almost. But yeah,
which makes this test all the more interesting because it is the Corridor of Doom. It is high ray tracing being used here, and you can see we're sort of sub 30 FPS, but the output frame rate is indeed 120 frames per second. Now, obviously, the bigger the gap there is between internal frame rate and the output 120 there, the more artifacts there are going to be, and you can kind of see that there. But when I switch to medium ray tracing and lower the resolution, so I actually use the DLSS transformer model here, 720p upscaling to 1440p, captured at 120 frames per second, it starts to be pretty good, I think. And you do have a variable frame rate, quite variable, in fact. Mm-hmm. And you do have a locked 120 coming out. I'm curious what you made of this footage, Alex.
Okay, well, I think this is pretty interesting, a little bit bizarre. It aligns a lot, though, with when we originally saw FSR 3, as well as what would become AFMF at the AMD booth at Gamescom in 2023, was it, Rich? 2020?
Oh, God.
Yeah, might have been.
Yeah. I think it was.
Yeah. There we talked with Nick Tibby-Rose, who now is left AMD, is over at Intel, if I'm not mistaken. And I asked him, like, what do you see as the future of frame generation? And he said at that point in time that you just have a really high refresh rate monitor, and we don't bother with VRR anymore. Yeah. Very interesting concept, by the way. We don't bother with VRR anymore, which is kind of like a headache in a lot of ways that we could get into. And you just allow frame generation to take whatever performance you can get and bring it up to the closest to the end output of your monitor. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. That input, the way lossless scaling shows it, there's like the input on the one side, and then that it shows you the output, and you can see the multiplicative factor. In the past, it would be done in a way where it would always be exactly double or exactly triple, and that's what you'd get as your final performance. But here, it's taking uneven frame rates and somehow getting them divisible to this output 120. You obviously recorded this. And I think that is kind of fascinating. I'm not exactly sure how it is doing it. I would almost want to imagine kind of like the equivalent of fast VSync. Maybe it is throwing out frames that it is not using. And
possibly. So I mean, you'd expect to see problems with panning in camera motion on that, surely.
Yeah, I guess so. But then, I mean, I don't understand it then. I don't actually understand it then. Off the top of my head, this requires more investigation.
Study.
Yeah.
It also requires asking the developer how he did it, which is what I've done. I haven't had a response yet, but I'm curious to see it because it's a really interesting concept. It's not without its flaws because latency is an issue. I can definitely feel the difference even with a controller, but the concept is intriguing. I don't know what you thought of it, Oliver.
Yeah, I mean, I think it looks really good in Control here. Actually, just scanning through your footage, Rich, I think it looks quite convincing here. At 120 FPS, surprisingly so, even though the base frame rate sometimes is dipping reasonably low there. it is looking pretty good. Now, in another title you did test, Starfield, it does look a little bit messier, which perhaps I could talk about in a moment. It also has issues with UI elements, which, like you'd expect, it's not like being properly composited in there, just operating on that final image. Personally, I've played a lot with LSFG, lossless scaling frame generation, especially in older software, and I actually generally find the quality of the frame gen to be pretty good for a lot of purposes, especially with LSFG 3, which improved a lot over LSFG 2. It's quite good. At high frame rates in particular, it works well, but I really like it with games that are older that have like 60 FPS caps. So I was playing just the other day, I was playing with lossless scaling, Sonic Racing Transformed. We talked about that a little bit last week. Perhaps, but that game at 120 FPS or 120 hertz with lossless scaling is a pretty good experience. Another title I've played with that is the new Crew game, the Crew Motorsport, which is locked to 60 FPS on PC, presumably for competitive reasons, which is very annoying, but it does look a lot better with LSFG there. So yeah, but I mean, for most new titles, I would prefer, obviously I prefer DLSS, obviously I'd prefer FSR, but for older games, I think it's terrific. And here, with that variable upscaling, based off of kind of an arbitrary base frame rate, that's really cool. And yeah, getting the potentially for that to work with VSync in a really convincing way, I'd like to see that in person for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just generally, I mean, in your video on lossless scaling, Alex, it was just like, well, this is a really cool piece of software. It's actually rather inexpensive. Just grab it on Steam, and so by that extension, I think it's just kind of worth buying. just generally. I wanted to also, I mean, Control is basically a GPU limited scenario, right? I was using ray tracing and whatnot there. But, just the concept of using a 4060 to get 120 frames per second with a 1440p output, it's really cool. CPU limited scenarios. Now that 3600 folds like a card table when you get to Aquila in Starfield. And I thought I'd just run our CPU benchmark on it, right? Because you get a high-speed run through Aquila. And, you're getting, especially when you're at 4K resolution or when you're hitting the CPU limit there, you just get, some really low frame rates. It goes into the 20s, and we're upscaling the output to 120 frames per second, which is just, it's a stupid thing to do. You shouldn't be doing it. But here we are. And you can basically see that the artifacts start to crop in there, particularly at the bottom of the screen and around the HUD element in the bottom right there. Those are the two most noticeable elements from my perspective. But, the automated benchmark that we've got goes through three resolutions, goes through 4K, 1440p, and 1080p. And basically, the lower the resolution you get, the less of a say the GPU has in it, and the more of a say that the Ryzen has in it. And basically, obviously, it's kind of obvious to say it really, but the lower the resolution you have, the higher the frame rate until you hit that CPU limit. But it's kind of okay, but it is sort of quite glaring there. And 1080p, I think at this point you can basically assume that you're CPU limited. We're into the 40s now, and the artifacts are still there, but they are somewhat lessened, but obviously still there. Now this is just basically an automated benchmark, which is designed to stress CPU, so you're kind of traversing faster than you would be in standard gameplay. So I went back to 4K. And went back into just sort of standard gameplay. And it holds up a lot better, I think, but there is still that kind of, I think you'd call it a warbling effect there, Alex.
I like my warbles.
Around the UI elements there. But, ultimately, we are looking at like Starfield at, between 30 to 40 FPS, producing a very, very smooth, consistently smooth output at 120, which is kind of nuts.
Yeah, it's a great proof of concept. I think from my hands-on feeling of what 30 to 120 feels like even on a controller, I probably would not like it. But that is like, because so you could inject reflex into a game. You could turn on reflex in a game if the game natively has reflex. Special K also allows you to inject I haven't fully investigated whether it functions exactly like Reflex, but something that is going to be a lot like Reflex, at least, based upon the naming and the way Caldeans described it, into a game. So you could at least get the equivalent Reflex thing, but it wouldn't change the fact that you're still manually queuing up all these frames and holding them for as long as you are at such a low base frame rate, which is a big part of Rich's whole MFG examination in his videos. And it's not gonna. This is definitely not mouse player territory. To say the least.
No. I mean, when we are in low frame rate territory, then obviously there's going to be a latency impact on that. And I mean, I kind of see this as a really nice thing to experiment with that may have application in certain titles for you. And it's certainly a really interesting demonstration of the concept of taking a variable frame rate and converting it to what looks to be a perceptibly smooth 120 output. Right. I think that's really, really cool. You know, the concept of being able to take a game that's running at an arbitrary frame rate and produce a convincing output that's locked at 120 here. You know, I've only tested 2 games, but even so, it's a really interesting demo. But as you say, Alex, there's 2 components to frame generation, of course, latency and quality of the output. Mm-hmm. And that was the other thing that I asked the developer, which was, well, question 1, how are you doing this? And number 2, what would be your chosen latency mitigation strategy for this? Because that's where I'm feeling it at the moment. But even so, really cool. I suggest people buy lossless scaling because it's not exactly expensive, and give it a go if you've got a high refresh rate display. I think you'll be quite impressed.